Welcome to the 242 Next Steps podcast. Our mission is to help people take next steps with God. We believe everyone has a next step. What's yours? And now your host, Jim Damon.
Hello and welcome to the 242 Next Steps podcast. I'm your host, Jim Damon, and on today's episode, we're going to tackle a topic that is glaring at us through our screens, our media feeds, and maybe even in our mirrors. We're going to wade through the turbulent water of race tension, and I've invited a special guest to join me today so that we could have some meaningful discourse on this. Our guest today is 242 teaching pastor Keith Brown. Keith, I want to thank you for coming onto the podcast and being willing to share with us your perspective on this cycle of racial injustice that we see unfolding yet again before our eyes.
Hey, what's going on, man? I'm glad to be here, and this is one of those subjects that is going to be, I think for a lot of people, I think I'm going to say some things that they didn't expect, but yet at the same time, I think that's part of what healthy dialogue is all about, is really engaging.
Mm-hmm. I anticipate that this podcast is going to invoke probably some emotions and opinions in a way that maybe the prior podcast haven't done. You know, when we see the violence, the movements, the protests, the riots, it's all really front and center right now, and in already what I would say is a tumultuous time in America. Keith, where is your head right now with everything that's going on?
Yeah, I go kind of up and down, right? I think on one hand, my immediate emotion is sadness. Mm-hmm. I feel sad for George Floyd's family. I feel sad for anybody who's a victim of violence. But when you have a minority who, I mean, we all watched the video. It was horrific to see what happened. So a sadness there. But then also a sadness for all the devastation that's come out of that. Mm-hmm. The cities that have been trashed, you know, I think I watched on the news the other day that the city of Minneapolis, $55 million in damages. And those are people and their livelihoods and their experiences. Right. And then just the emotion around that. Like, so a real sadness on all sides is really what I feel right now.
Mm-hmm. Keith, if it's okay with you, I want in this episode to be a place where two individuals from two different racial backgrounds can ask and answer some questions that maybe feel uncomfortable or leave us feeling a little vulnerable, but are rooted in honest curiosity and a willingness to learn and grow. Are you okay with that?
Absolutely.
All right, well then let's do that. Before we get into those questions, let's take a minute because I'm curious, and I'm sure our audience is, to learn a little bit more about where you grew up, how you got into ministry. And I know that you've lived in a couple different states throughout your life. I'd love to know, like, what is it that Michigan has that those other states don't have quite as well, or and vice versa? What were those places that you've grown up that, you know, they have things that Michigan just can't quite offer?
Yeah, I would say the number one thing that Michigan has that the other places that I've lived in doesn't have is endless winters. So just the idea that it snows from January to, it feels like December. So
I think we're due for some snow probably this weekend, actually, Keith, if you watch out.
Yeah, for sure. I remember when I first moved here. So we recently moved back 3 years ago, but collectively I've lived here 10 years and my wife grew up here. And so I'll never forget it snowing on Easter when we got back here. And I thought, we're back in Michigan. You know what I mean? So I would say that. But I would also say, for me, Michigan has a sense of community. I mean, I'm just talking about myself as somebody who moved here, that I feel like is something that's very special. Mm-hmm. And then the lakes is something that growing up mostly in the South, and then I lived in the West for a little bit. There's a beauty to Michigan of the ruralness to it. So those are, I guess, are my general thoughts.
Okay. And you mentioned that you've grown up in a couple different places. What were some of those places that you grew up in? I'm just curious. I know as a teaching pastor, you've probably had a decent ministry background growing up and how you got into ministry. Would you mind sharing that?
Yep. So I was born and raised in Southeast Louisiana, and that was where I spent kind of the first 20 years of my life. And then from there, moved to Dallas-Fort Worth after the first part of Bible college and enjoyed that. But it was a pretty big change from Southeast Louisiana. So Louisiana, the entire state, is 5 million people.
Okay.
Dallas-Fort Worth, from Dallas to Fort Worth, there's 65 cities. That metroplex is, so all those cities combined between Dallas and Fort Worth, 7 million people. So that was quite a change.
That's a concentration right there. That's rubbing elbows with people.
Yeah. Very fast-paced and also very diverse. Like, I think some people have this image of Dallas is that it's an ultra-conservative place, and there are parts of it that is, but when you just have that many people, very different. Well, from there, I moved here to Michigan the first time to the southwest side of Michigan and was here for 7 years. That's where there for 7 years. That's where I met my wife, had our first 2 kids. And then we actually did some church planting back in Dallas after being at that church. And then we moved to Southern California, was there for 5 years, and then back to Michigan. So
wow.
In the whole journey, roughly 20 years of ministry and a lot of different experiences along the way.
A man of many states is what I would say. That's very cool. I've been to Texas too, and it's hot there. They have like endless summer, at least in my opinion.
Louisiana, right? So the difference between Texas and Louisiana is the humidity. In Louisiana, it's humid. In Texas, it's dry, but it gets hot. Or North Texas.
Right on. I don't know which I hate most, extreme cold or extreme hot. Just give me something in the middle. So, well, thank you for sharing that. I think it would be great now to kind of get into our conversation at hand. I'm just going to make the statement that, the United States right now is anything but united. At least that's what it feels like to me. In fact, we may be more divided in some ways than we have been in quite some time. And the resurfacing of racial tension yet again has been compounded by the fact that there's been excessive force used in this particular situation that you mentioned, resulting in the death of George Floyd. As the world is watching protests and riots, social media blackouts dominating the news, I just want to begin by maybe you sharing with us from your cultural lens, from your, just your reaction, your thoughts, your emotions when the news broke of George Floyd's death.
Yeah, I think my initial response was not again. Like we've seen these, it feels like we've heard this story, but this is a family. This is an individual who, there's conflicting stories on what he was doing or why he was arrested, but I think nobody feels like it's right in America for a person to die for a minor offense, something that didn't have to happen. So I think really that was my initial emotion and reaction was not again. What was your question again? Sorry. I don't know.
Yeah, I just wanted to know, certainly I remember just a short time ago seeing the video myself and just the initial reaction of just disbelief, as I watched the video, which was all over social media. I mean, we live in a time now where you don't have to dig very far to find what happened because people have cameras. And so I recall, my initial reaction still very vividly. I just wondered what your initial reaction, I'm guessing you saw that video. I'm guessing you saw some of the initial news reports on it. Just what was that first feeling? What was that first emotion that you had as you watched that happen?
Yeah, I actually have still not watched the whole video because I just can't. I feel like to watch a man die on video just seems horrible and cruel.
Yeah.
Yet at the same time, there's also this reality that maybe we wouldn't know about it unless there was a smartphone. So, so really, real divided feelings on it. But yet at the same time, really, really sad and disappointed for him and his family and for everybody involved, really. And also those cops, I can't put myself in their minds or hearts, but at the same time, their life will never be the same as well. And neither should it. But at the same time, there's a lot of dynamics that play when you have a tragedy, when trauma happens.
this might be $1 million question. I guess if you had the answer for it, or I had the answer, somebody had the answer, we wouldn't even be talking about this. But it is 2020. Why on earth have we not reached a space in our civilization in the United States where racism is not a thing anymore? Why are we not there yet?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this one for a little bit, and so I'm a pastor, right? So I have to come at it from my biblical fidelity, and I would say my short answer is because there's sin in the world. Mm-hmm. That's why we have it, is because the sin of racism is a very real sin for a lot of people. So that's my short answer. But I guess my more extended answer would be, I think there's a few things. One is I think there's pain. There's brokenness in people's hearts and lives. And I would imagine if you grew up in a home that was racist and then they passed that along to you, you might not outwardly be racist as far as in the way you dress or act or whatever, but that was something that was passed along to you. And typically that comes from a hurt, a pain. And I think generally speaking, we all take the pain in our heart and we transfer that to others. And so I think that that's part of it. I also think that there is, I think, if you go back to like the 60s, so my parents were born in the 50s and they lived throughout the 60s. Mm-hmm. Racism then was much more overt, right? It was much more clear. It was much more understandable. Where our culture began to shift and it became less fashionable to be racist. And so what I think in a lot of ways is many people who still have racist tendencies, they just went underground. So racism never really left. It just went underground. And so I think in some ways, even though culture it's not popular to be racist, people are still racist, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I guess what I'm hearing you say is through the brokenness, the hurts, the incidents that wound us, racism really still lives on through generations, and it lives on through relational acts, good, bad, or otherwise. It's just perpetuated through those two areas in our life, and that's why it's still kind of hanging around, huh?
Yeah, and that's my opinion. I think this is a unique conversation for me to have because I feel like I'm going to come at this from a different point of view because I've had very different experiences. And as we kind of get into this, I'll share some of those experiences that may not be as mainstream if you talk to somebody else who maybe had a different point of view or experience.
Okay. Yeah, no, I look forward to hearing what you have to say on those. So let me ask this. Is there any sacred place where we see racism obsolete at this point? I mean, I'm thinking you and I, we both work in ministry. We work in a church. We work for a church. Is racism obsolete in church? Like, where is there any place where you could say, I don't see evidence of racism today?
Yeah, I would say I don't think so, and here's why. I think you still have racist people, and if my hypothesis is true, which I think in some ways it is, that I think a lot of people have taken that underneath the ground. It's not popular to be racist, but people are still racist. And I'll give you an example. I remember I was watching I think it was a 2020 report or something like that, and this was right around the whole Charlottesville deal, and there was a lot of tension there. There was a guy who was a part of the it's kind of like the neo-Nazi movement, and he had his face covered up. And part of the reason he had his face covered up was because he said, hey, I'm a Baptist pastor. I would hate for people to know that I have these thoughts and feelings because it's not fashionable anymore. But I also think that people of color have to be careful too, that we don't become racist as well and assume that we're always going to be oppressed and everybody you meet is going to be racist. That's what I think is a real challenge. And that's the part that I think there's some people who really don't want to hear that. But yet at the same time, I think it's true because we can't get along if we're always going to have offenses. And it's not fair for me to take something that happened to me a long time ago and transfer that to you. You had nothing to do with that. But I think sometimes that happens in communities of color. And I know that firsthand because I'm a person of color. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I'm glad that you bring up that point, and that's where my next question goes. You know, for myself, I'm a middle-aged guy. I'm a white male. I grew up in a very small town in the middle of a country cow town in the middle of Michigan, and I've often wondered like what do I do? Like where is my voice in this in terms of like, how do I help and how do I assist in change? Because the last thing that I want to have happen is for anybody to look at me and think that automatically that I think in that sort of racial perspective. I don't want to be lumped in that group. So what is it that I do? What advice would you have for me?
Yeah, I think the first thing that I would say is I think one of the challenges in the majority culture, which would be, mostly white people, is that sometimes I think there is a thought that Black people are monolithic in the way they think, in the way they vote, in the way they live. And I think it's really important to listen and develop relationships. Because what I think we will find, both of us, as far as when I say both of us, I'm talking about people of color and the majority culture as well, is that we probably have a lot more in common. And I think as we listen and as we don't walk in with these preconceived ideas and we get to know people as individuals, we will see maybe there's some common themes in their story, but people are different. And so, like, if you were to talk to Black people who grew up in a certain area in Southeast Louisiana and then Black people who grew up in a certain area of the North, you'd find so many differences there that I think that would begin to help understand more of the nuance. The other thing I think that is important is I think sometimes the majority culture are dismissive of the pain and the stories of people of color. And I think that that's unwise because it destroys the opportunity to really understand. And so I think the idea is to really listen and ask questions and really get a greater understanding. And just because something didn't happen to you or people that you know doesn't mean that it's not happening. And just because it may not happen to everybody does not mean that it doesn't still go on. So I think not being dismissive is part of it.
So yeah, go ahead, Keith. No, I was just going to say, I love that you're pointing out that one of the first things everybody needs to do is stop overgeneralizing. When we overgeneralize, when we lump people, when we lump ideas together, we don't give people an opportunity to speak to their individuality, which may look very different from the next person. So I really appreciate that. That's a good point for me. Is just stop in any way, shape, or form generalizing. Like, get to know each person as an individual. Yeah, I think that's an important part of it. And then I think being able to do some reading about different things, and I think that's where it's really helpful for people to really take some time and go. Like, I would imagine if you were going to be a missionary to another place, what you would do is you would spend time in the culture, you would learn the language, and you would really understand that process is going to take time. And I think that that's sometimes what doesn't happen is people don't take the time to develop a cultural competency. Cultural competency, I like that. Do you think that we can overcome this? Do you think that there is a time that's going to exist where the overt violence, the subtle discrimination is going to melt away? I mean, do you see that happening for our generation, for our kids' generation, our kids' kids' generation? What do you think?
So I think we can. I'm hopeful and optimistic, but I also think that, sin is still in the world. So the fact that this will never happen again, there's a part of me that just has to be realistic and say, if people will still struggle with sin and if the sin of racism is still in the world, yes, it could happen again. But I have more of a positive point of view, because a lot of people talk about systemic racism, which I think is something that's real. Mm-hmm. But I think sometimes people don't also focus on systemic change. And I think systemic changes have been happening. And if you even look at the statistics, so younger people have both black and white and Asian and whatever, they have a much more desire to talk about subjects like race. Mm-hmm. And they have much more of a desire to be willing to understand more. And so I think there's a cultural shift that there's a natural desire to understand that more. And I mean, if you just think about like access to different opportunities, I would say in my life that because I'm black, I've had certain opportunities, because I think that there's many people who are saying, I don't want the sins of my father to be upon me. So I want to be very intentional about that. And so I think we need to really spend our time focusing and talking about systemic change while we're talking about systemic racism. Because if you only focus on one, I think it becomes problematic in the sense that it's hard to make progress. And I think it's also discouraging to people in the majority culture who are saying, hey, number one, I'm not racist and I'm really trying. I'm doing these things. But it feels like there is a certain how do I want to say this? This is what I think we're going to get some emails about. But I think that there's certain people in our culture who don't want to highlight progress because it doesn't feed into the narrative that we're always going to be a broken and a racist people. And I don't know why that is, but that's my perspective. And this is the part that I think that you may get some emails about or whatever, is that I talked about my experience being very different. So I have never gotten stopped by the cops when I wasn't speeding. Mm-hmm. If anything, the times that I've gotten stopped by the cops, so only 5 times in 20 plus years of driving now, I was speeding and I assumed I was going to get a ticket because I was doing something wrong, right? And these have been in back roads, these have been in big cities, and almost every time it's been a white cop. And every time I told them that I was a pastor, which wasn't part of my MO to get out of a ticket. It was just like, hey, I'm kind of embarrassed or whatever. I got let go. So it's one of those scenarios where I'm not saying that this doesn't happen. I know people who this has happened to. I know people, you know what I mean, in our church who this has happened to, but my experience is different, which leads me to just say that I think that there are a lot of people who are trying to make progress, and we have to acknowledge that, because if we don't, I think that in some ways we're also feeding to the problem.
No, that's good. So within that systemic change, you've mentioned things like listening to people, not overgeneralizing, doing your research. Those are all some ways to participate in systemic change. Can you give me like one more thing that you would say we could do as a next step, regardless of our race, regardless of our skin color? What's one thing that we could do? This is a Next Steps podcast. I always like to kind of wrap us up talking about a next step. What's something that everybody, regardless of what you look like, could do starting today in that systemic change to kind of turn the wheels to where we need to go with this?
Yeah, actually, can I give you a few more bullet points? I've got a list of stuff that I wrote down.
Please do. Yeah, I love that.
And I want to give some credit to where credit is due. So Pete Scazzaro, he is famous for emotionally healthy spirituality, and he's got an emotionally healthy leader and so forth. He's got a podcast actually out. called Emotionally Healthy Discipleship. Here's some of the things that he says. I think these are helpful for us if we want to grow in this. Number one is he says that we should practice solitude and silence. And in that, we should really ask God to search our heart for any unconscious biases that we have or any prejudices that sometimes we don't know. Like, it may be something where we naturally discriminate against people for a lot of different reasons, and allowing God to search us. It's kind of that prayer of the Psalm, God, search me, know me, see if there's any unclean way in me. The second thing he talks about is actually having emotionally healthy conversations, like to have safe conversations. And I think Steve, our interim lead pastor, is going to talk about this in a message that he's going to give. But the idea about having conversations, and I think having safe conversations to say, hey, you're a person who's different from me. Let's kind of dialogue, and I want you to help me see if there's something I'm seeing the wrong way. Actually, Today I had one of those conversations, and I thought it was really productive for me.
Oh, great.
The next thing is really think about your story, your family story, and take some time to see how that could be affecting the way you treat people who are different from you. And then the next thing he talks about is modeling weakness and vulnerability. I think sometimes it's a good thing for us just to confess. Like, as we go through this journey of kind of dealing with our own stuff, I think for you to be able to tell me, hey, Keith, I just have to be honest with you and say, as I've been kind of on this journey, I realized that I had some biases towards you that were not right. And I think in our culture, it's not safe to do that, right? Because of the social media mob. If we confess anything, people jump on us. But I think part of having great relationships is being able to own some of that and journey through that. And then I think lastly, and this is going to sound super churchy, but I think we need to really grow in our desire to be like Jesus. I think oftentimes when we say we want to be like Jesus, we want to be like the version of Jesus we have in our mind. And the version of Jesus we have in our mind could be the entrepreneurial Jesus or the whatever. We have these pictures of Jesus, but Jesus was radical in the way that he showed love to other people. And he was radical about getting out of his comfort zone. And so I think the more we become like Jesus, the less we become like people who are discriminatory and racist and things like that. And then I've got a couple books that I would encourage people to read. One is a book called How to Think by Alan Jacobs. He's a professor, and he talks about how we live in this culture where everybody gets so ginned up about stuff and thinking in more of a way that's more critical and really challenging, not just getting emotionally wired up. And then the last one is a book by Dr. Ed Stetzer called Christians in the Age of Outrage. I think part of why we can't come together is I think we're quick to get angry and blame and when we become suspicious instead of really taking some time and think, okay, if I'm angry, could that anger be coming from an unhealthy place? Instead of me blaming you, Jesus said, look at yourself in your own eye. You know what I mean? Take the plank out of your own eyes before you do that. And I think if we were able to control our anger and we had less destruction and more dialogue, I think we would have we get there faster.
That's good. And I love those book recommendations. Christians in the Age of Outrage is a great book. I love that one. And we'll make sure that we make note of those for the podcast so people can take a look at those. Well, Keith, the last question I wanted to ask, I wondered if you wanted to speak directly in the end of this podcast to the Black community that's hurting and really having to, make a choice right now to either protest in some way, peacefully, or maybe even those making choices to riot with action behind that. What is it that you would want to say to both of those groups, the group that wants to let their voice be heard peacefully, and then that group that feels like I need to act in a way that's really going to let people know how I feel?
Yeah. So I would say for those who want to protest peacefully, I would say we're all with you. I would say everybody's with you. The whole nation is with you. And your voice can make a difference peacefully. I think about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. That was part of why he was able to make such an impact, was because of his peaceful protest, and he was able to create a movement. For those who are destructive and feel like that's the only way to be heard, I would say your pain matters. But I would also say, if you fast forward to 5 years from now, 10 years from now, would you want to look back on this time in your life and think about the fact that you destroyed people's businesses, you destroyed people's family, you ended up getting arrested, and you ended up maybe perpetuating a stereotype that you didn't want to be true about you? I think most of us would love to have a do-over. And I think what wisdom is have a do-over before you have to have a do-over. Is to really kind of look back and say, hey, I don't want that to be my story. And so instead of doing that, I'm going to choose a better way. I think we all have choices. And I think it's wiser to choose a way of persuasion versus I'm going to try to push my agenda.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Keith, I want to also thank you for your willingness to just share your perspective on, what's going on in society and what we can do to potentially take that next step in change. I'm just curious, as we finish up, any next steps for you as this continues to unfold? Anything that you're thinking like this is where I need to go next?
Yeah, I've never seen myself as a social justice warrior. Because that's just not kind of the moniker I want to be kind of known by. I've always seen myself as a pastor, but I realize that I have a perspective and a voice that needs to be heard. And so I feel like for me, wanting to use that platform that I have to make sure that I represent what God's called me to represent, because I think that that's something important. But then really spend a lot of time listening to people of my own race who have a different experience of mine, and then listening to others and answering the question, because I think a lot of people like you, I would consider us friends, or people are coming to me and say, Keith, what should I do?
Yeah.
And I think for a long time, I've kind of not wanted to be that guy, but I realized that in these times, I really do. So trying to be very strategic and very thoughtful in how I'm helping my friends of the majority culture relate to the Black culture. So somewhat being a link.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you for being that for me today. I do appreciate that. And thanks for being on the podcast. I also want to thank you, the listener, for tuning in on this journey with us on the 242 Next Steps podcast. I would encourage you to check back next week as we have a new episode, a new topic, and a new guest.
Thank you for joining us on today's podcast. If you like what you just listened to or know someone who would, be sure to check out more great content from wherever you stream your podcasts. Simply search 242 Next Steps Podcast.